So once he actually came to power, Edward III had to begin the process of sort of healing some of the division that had erupted during his father's reign. And also, he makes some decisions about how he, in particular, wants to pursue foreign policy moving forward. So, obviously, the Hundred Years' War is sort of at the core of his reign, but he does also have some other tasks, in particular, sort of restoring royal authority, trying to end some of the division that had emerged in the previous sort of decades. Also, his personality is very much sort of key to his ability to do that. These accounts are obviously clouded by subjectivity and bias, but it's particularly compared to his father. He is resoundingly sort of praised. He's considered congenial. He's also considered an effective sort of authority figure. He doesn't abuse feudal prerogatives like some of his predecessors, so he does seem to earn the respect of a lot of his nobles that way. Another sort of challenge we've seen for a lot of these monarchs is particularly those who have a lot of sons and sons that reach early adulthood is maintaining their loyalty and preventing sort of infighting. We do not see any of that in the family of Edward. And in part, this is sort of parallels his pursuit of war against France, but the emergence of sort of this sense of patriotism, much increasingly much sort of rigid lines between England and France than we've seen since the conquest, when a lot of people had sort of a foot on each side of the channel. That is going to sort of end. And the French and the English are increasingly going to see themselves as different and distinct. And a lot of this effectiveness is because he does provide the sort of military leadership and leads a number of successful campaigns that his father did not. And this is an image of him here. You can see him sort of seated on the throne. So the Hundred Years' War is a term that we use in hindsight. Obviously, they didn't use it to describe sort of a series of conflicts between France and England over the course of about a 100-year period. Obviously, they don't fight the entire time. There's a lot of stopping and starting, and there are sort of two major phases. And so we'll talk about that first phase today. In terms of sort of political motivations, there is still this sense that some of the territories that are in France that were at one point part of that Angevin Empire should be recovered. In particular, their sort of greatest chance stands in the south, where they still kind of are holding on to this area around Gascony and what was sort of formerly the Aquitaine. Also, there is still a lot of residual anger during all of those wars with Scotland. France was arguably the staunchest ally that the Scots could call upon, and so they sort of have this history of some division there. And then also, just in terms of his ability to provide sort of leadership, one of the things that distinguishes increasingly these late medieval English kings is their ability to effectively fight. And that sort of warrior role, that warrior ethos, becomes central to their ability to command the authority of their nobles. It also gives the nobles themselves an opportunity to demonstrate their own sort of militaristic prowess, and that's also key to their identity. In terms of economics, one of the areas that has been sort of subject to a lot of dispute is Flanders, which is sort of in the very north here, right across from England. So this is modern day Belgium and parts of France. It's very urbanized, and it is an outlet for a lot of English wool. So the English raise the sheep. They send the wool to Flanders, where it gets made into cloth, and that's a really lucrative source of revenue for the English. The French have been threatening that trade by controlling Flanders, so England wants to make sure they can keep those markets open. And then sort of the immediate catalyst is in 1337. Philip IV confiscates some of England's lands around Gascony, and so that becomes sort of the immediate spark that sort of leads to the invasion by England. There is also this dynastic claim. It's pretty flimsy, and even the English know that, but it does give Edward this other sort of justification for his actions. It's not just pragmatic. he does claim that, you can see here, Philip IV, who is Edward III's grandfather, has 4 children. He has 3 sons and a daughter, Isabella. When Philip dies, his eldest son, Louis, succeeds him. Louis does have a daughter and a son, but the son dies in infancy, and then Louis also dies very young. At that time, then the crown passes to his younger brother, Philip. Philip does not have any sons who managed to outlive him. So then when Philip dies, shortly after that, in 1322, the crown passes to Charles IV. Charles IV also has children, but no male offspring. And so when Charles dies in 1328, they track back the family line, and it goes back up to the children of Philip III, and then down through the Valois line. And then the current sort of claimant to the throne through the Valois line are the cousins of Philip IV. And so Philip VI becomes king. At the time this all happens in 1128, you just had that deposition of Edward II, and so the English don't say anything about it really. However, as time passes, Edward III says, when that happened, the crown should have passed to my mother Isabella, and through Isabella, it then should have passed to me. The English or the French claim that the crown cannot pass through women, and obviously Isabella's older brothers had daughters, so it would have passed to them. But this is just sort of the justification that Edward gives. In part, he's invading because he's also claiming the crown of England. So the first phase, very early on, Edward's approach is to invade, but he thinks the key is to have this large coalition of forces. And so he forms alliances with some German contingents and the Dutch in Netherlands. However, these allies require a lot of money. And so gradually he spends a lot of money trying to secure these alliances, not super successfully. They don't actually provide a lot of troops. And so to the extent that there is fighting, it's pretty small scale, and Edward does not manage to gain a lot of territory. However, after sort of learning his lesson and having to deal with that depleted treasury, he changes his strategy slightly. When he pursues the war in the 1340s, it's just with English troops, though he does include some mercenaries, some paid soldiers in there. And then the idea is what we're going to do as we sort of move through French territory is we don't need a lot of provisions in advance because we're just going to sort of live off the land, whatever we conquer. So we're going to confiscate crops. We're going to confiscate livestock. We're going to sort of live off the wealth of France, and that's how we're going to sustain our troops. This proves to be much more successful. By 1342, he controls most of the county of Brittany, which is sort of that northern part of France. And there are a number of illustrations of the 100 Years' War that are super useful for giving us sort of visual insight, particularly into sort of the military techniques. But this one, these come from Jean Froissart's Chronicles. And you can see the English forces here on the right, the standard that they're flying. So you have the yellow and red, those are the Lions of England. And then to sort of reinforce this claim that he's actually reclaiming the throne of France, Edward has added the French fleur-de-lis. So the blue flowers or the white flowers on the blue background, which is the chivalric symbol of the kings of France. So in 1346, another sort of large-scale invasion. This is led by Edward III's eldest son, Edward, known as the Black Prince. He is also a very effective military commander. His father, Edward the King, had special black armor made for him, hence the nickname. A pretty sizable force. You can see the extent of the reliance upon archers, which I'll talk about in a little bit. A lot of what Edward is trying to do here isn't so much actually conquer territory. He realizes he doesn't really have the resources to do that. but he just wants to inflict enough harm on these areas in northern France that he can force the king of France to make some concessions. And this is exactly what he does. So they pursue a policy called chevauchée. So these are like raids, local raids. So you just move into villages, you move into towns, you take anything of value in terms of crops or livestock or movable wealth that these peasants might have. Everything else you burn down, you destroy. Because there are a lot of mercenaries in this army, they a lot of times aren't terribly well controlled or disciplined. So there's probably a lot of raping as well, and a lot of destruction of people and property. They do capture the cities of Caen and Rouen, and so begin to make their way up north towards the port city of Calais. And then this is a moment when the French actually do amass a significant army to try and prevent the English from making further inroads into this northern territory. So this particular battle, what Edward does is he manages to locate a more favorable position at the plain of Crécy. And so his troops then, you can see the Black Prince is leading part of them. They're sort of aligned along this ridge. This means that the French have to attack uphill. There had been several days of rain, and so that ground is actually quite muddy. They're also hemmed in on one side by that river, so that's going to sort of limit some of their mobility and flexibility and choices. The French do... It would make more sense for the French, given the configuration of this battleground, for them to try and get the English to attack them, particularly because the French army, as you can see, those front lines are crossbowmen. The crossbow is a really powerful weapon, but it's very slow to load, and it's a weapon, it's a defensive weapon. So it's very difficult to mount an offensive attack running with a crossbow. So the rain slows down that charge of knights because the French do give the order to attack immediately. They are decimated. The difficulty of going uphill in muddy ground bogs down the cavalry. The English also have, remember, those 10,000 archers. These are longbowmen. They are very effective in inflicting damage on the French knights as well as the French infantry. And it's just a complete rout. The French eventually will flee the field of battle. That river, though, sort of limits where they can go, and a lot of men end up getting drowned or captured in the river. They lose about a third of their army. So the Battle of Crécy is decisive. This is another image from Froissart's Chronicles. And so this is a picture of King Edward and the Black Prince sort of surveying all the dead on the battleground. You can see some of what's happening here. In part as reward or payment for their services, the nobles would have been captured, ideally kept alive, and ransomed back as a source of revenue. The average infantry who die in the battlefield would be stripped and anything of value sort of removed from their body, and then the rest would be buried. Then they continue their progress northward, capturing the port city of Calais. But before anything else can happen, Black Plague hits everywhere in Europe, and no one is in a position to actually fight a war. So there is this sort of temporary interlude. And then in 1355, the English resume a large-scale invasion. Edward's younger son, John of Gaunt, sort of leads his forces in the north. Prince Edward is going to lead the forces in the south, beginning to make some inroads up into sort of this central part of France, and particularly continuing this policy of chevauchée, which has just proved sort of devastating. And really for the French, they don't have the resources to really effectively mount another large-scale pitched battle, but there's so much pressure put upon them by the chevauchée and the disaster that it's causing that they really have no choice. So in September of 1356, a French army under King John II eventually sort of catches up with Edward, the Black Prince. He manages to sort of set up a fairly favorable position initially, However, the French, in spite of the losses at Crécy, haven't really made any alterations to their battle plan, particularly still relying on these armored knights on horseback and the impact of a cavalry charge and also those crossbowmen. So you can kind of see here the configuration of the two lines of battle. Once again, the French are able to, even though they're outnumbered considerably, to maximize the impact of those longbowmen, and also they are able to, so the Black Prince is able to sort of sneak through some trees to the right of the battlefield and then penetrate those two lines of the French forces and separate them, and then the French are forced to fight on two sides. Only about 1,000 English soldiers are lost in the course of the battle. Almost 3 times that number of Frenchmen die, and almost as many then are captured. So Poitiers is another huge victory for the English. Things are almost unilaterally going their way. In 1360 then, one of the other outcomes of the Battle of Poitiers is that the King of France himself, John II, was taken prisoner. He's been removed to a place where he can be confined in England. So this really forces the rest of the French to come to the table and negotiate the Treaty of Bretigny, the terms of which are very, very favorable to the English. So the Black Prince marries Isabella, who is a member of the royal family. 3 million gold crowns is set at the ransom of King John II. Edward II agrees to renounce his claim to the throne if the French agreed to acknowledge the English control of territory up around Calais, but more specifically there in the south. And so you can see in this map, they significantly expanded their holdings north and also east. And so they've acquired more territory in France than they had previously. One of the other outcomes, or I guess one of the developments that happens in the course of the war, is we really do see that they're fighting differently. And this isn't just about military techniques, it also has some important sort of social implications moving forward. The English, unlike the French, have been fighting pretty much on and off for decades. So all those wars against the Scots, all those wars against the Welsh. So you have some pretty seasoned soldiers, you have some experienced battle commanders, and they've also made significant adaptations to the way they fight. The most significant, as I mentioned before, is replacing the crossbow with the longbow. And this image from Froissart shows you the French on the left using the crossbow and the English on the right with the longbow. They actually learned this from the Welsh. The longbow is about 6 feet from end to end. It has a pull of about 100 pounds. It can send an arrow much, much further than a short bow or a crossbow. And in part, because the pull on it is so heavy, there are accounts that it can penetrate sort of an oak door several inches. And this is sort of debated by historians, but some suggest it could even penetrate plate armor. In any case, it's absolutely devastating on the horses that these knights are riding. If you knock a horse out from under one of these knights, their armor has become so heavy and so cumbersome that they cannot stand back up without help. Also, the infantry are decimated by these longbows. They can release about 10 times as many arrows as a crossbow, and they're also much easier to reload. So, this adaptation of the longbowmen, in addition to reliance on mercenaries and infantry, not only make the English army more flexible and more effective, but it also sort of increasingly is going to challenge the continued sort of usefulness of the armored knight on horseback. It's a much more expensive way to fight. It is not proving as effective moving forward. And that's going to have implications just for sort of the position of these nobles in society generally. Remember, the reason why you have these knights, these nobles, is because they used to be key to providing protection and defense. If they've been sort of replaced by mercenaries and archers, paid professional soldiers, then what is their claim to sort of continuing to monopolize power and authority? And this is just to give you an idea, the illustration. So the top you have a longbow, obviously recreated. And then on the bottom you have a typical medieval crossbow. So very different types of weapons with very different effectiveness.